Horrid Henry's wedding. Duh, duh, duh! I'm not wearing these horrible clothes, and that's that! Horrid Henry glared at the mirror. A stranger, smothered in a lilac ruffled shirt, green satin knickerbockers, tights, pink cummerbund tied in a floppy bow, and pointy white satin shoes with gold buckles, glared back at him. Henry had never seen anyone looking so silly in his life. Ah! 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 Shrieked Horrid Henry, pointing at the mirror. Then Henry peered more closely. The ridiculous-looking boy was him! Perfect Peter stood next to Horrid Henry. He too was smothered in a lilac ruffled shirt, green satin knickerbockers, tights, pink cummerbund and pointy white shoes with gold buckles. But unlike Henry, Peter was smiling. "Aren't they adorable?" squealed Prissy Polly. "That's how my children always going to dress." Prissy Polly was Horrid Henry's horrible older cousin. Prissy Polly was always squeaking and squealing. "Eek! It's a speck of dust. Eek! It's a puddle. Eek! My hair is a mess." But when Prissy Polly announced she was getting married to Pimply Paul and wanted Henry and Peter to be page boys, Mum said yes before Henry could stop her. "What's a page boy?" asked Henry suspiciously. "A page boy carries the wedding rings down the aisle on a satin cushion," said Mum. "And throws confetti afterwards," said Dad. Henry liked the idea of throwing confetti, but carrying rings on a cushion? No thanks. "I don't want to be a page boy," said Henry. I do, said Peter. "You're going to be a page boy, and that's that," said Mum. "And you'll behave yourself," said Dad. "It's very kind of Cousin Polly to ask you." Henry scowled. "Who want to be married to her?" said Henry. "I want if you paid me £1,000,000. But for some reason the bridegroom, Pimply Paul, did want to marry Prissy Polly. And as far as Henry knew, he had not been paid £1,000,000. Pimply Paul was also trying on his wedding clothes. He looked ridiculous in a black top hat, lilac shirt, and a black jacket covered in gold swirls. "I don't want to wear these silly clothes," said Henry. "Oh, be quiet, you little brat," snapped Pimply Paul. Horrid Henry glared at him. "I won't," said Henry, "and that's final." "Henry, stop being horrid," said Mum. She looked extremely silly in a big floppy hat, dripping with flowers. Suddenly Henry grabbed at the lace ruffles round his throat. "I'm choking," he gasped. "I can't breathe." Then Henry fell to the floor and rolled around. "Ah!" moaned Henry. "I'm dying." "Get up this minute, Henry," said Dad. "Eek! There's stairs on the floor!" shrieked Polly. "Can't you control that child?" hissed Pimply Paul. "I don't want to be a page boy," howled Horrid Henry. "Thank you so much for asking me to be a page boy, Polly," shouted Perfect Peter, trying to be heard over Henry's screams. "You're welcome," shouted Polly. "Stop that, Henry," ordered Mum. "I've never been so ashamed in my life." "I hate children," muttered Pimply Paul under his breath. Horrid Henry stopped. Unfortunately, his page boy clothes looked as fresh and crisp as ever. "All right," thought Horrid Henry. "You want me at this wedding? You've got me." Prissy Polly's wedding day arrived. Henry was delighted to see rain pouring down. How cross Polly would be. Perfect Peter was already dressed. "Isn't this going to be fun, Henry?" said Peter. "No," said Henry, sitting on the floor, "and I'm not going." Mum and Dad stuffed Henry into his page boy clothes. It was hard, heavy work. Finally, everyone was in the car. "We're going to be late," shrieked Mum. "We're going to be late," shrieked Dad. "We're going to be late," shrieked Peter. "Good," muttered Henry. Mum, Dad, Henry and Peter arrived at the church. Boom! There was a clap of thunder. Rain poured down. All the other guests were already inside. "Watch for the puddles, boys," said Mum as she leapt out of the car. She opened her umbrella. Dad jumped over the puddle. Peter jumped over the puddle. Henry jumped over the puddle and tripped. Splash! "Oopsie," said Henry. His ruffles were torn, his knickerbockers were filthy, and his satin shoes were soaked. Mum, Dad, and Peter were covered in muddy water. Perfect Peter burst into tears. "You ruined my page-boy clothes!" sobbed Peter. Mum wiped as much dirt as she could off Henry and Peter. "It was an accident, Mum." "Really?" said Henry. "Hurry up, you're late," shouted Pimply Paul. Mum and Dad dashed into the church. Henry and Peter stayed outside, waiting to make their entrance. Pimply Paul and his best man, Cross Colin, stared at Henry and Peter. "You look a mess," said Paul. "It was an accident," said Henry. Peter snivelled. "Now be careful with the wedding rings," said Cross Colin. He handed Henry and Peter a satin cushion each, with a gold ring on top. A great quivering clump of lace and taffeta and bows and flowers approached. Henry guessed Prissy Polly must be lurking somewhere underneath. "Eek!" squeaked the clump. "Why did it have to rain on my wedding?" "Eek!" squealed the clump again. "You filthy!" Perfect Peter began to sob. The satin cushion trembled in his hand. The ring balanced precariously near the edge. Cross Colin snatched Peter's cushion. You can't carry a ring with your hand shaking like that," sniffed Colin. "You'd better carry them both, Henry." "Come on," hissed Pimply Paul. "We're late." Cross Colin and Pimply Paul dashed into the church. The music started. Henry pranced down the aisle after Polly. Everyone stood up. Henry beamed and bowed and waved. He was King Henry the Horrible, smiling graciously at his cheering subjects before he chopped off their heads. As he danced along, he stepped on Rilly Rolly's long, trailing dress. "Rip!" squeaked Prissy Polly. Part of Polly's train lay beneath Henry's muddy satin shoe. That dress was too long anyway, thought Henry. He kicked the fabric out of the way and stomped down the aisle. The bride, groom, best man, and page boys assembled in front of the minister. Henry stood, and stood, and stood. The minister droned on, and on, and on. Henry's arm holding up the cushion began to ache. "This is boring," thought Henry, jiggling the rings on the cushion. Boing, boing, boing. "Ooh," thought Henry, "I'm good at ring tossing." The rings bounced. The minister droned. Henry was a famous pancake chef, tossing the pancakes higher and higher and higher. Clink, clunk. The rings rolled down the aisle and vanished down a small grate. "Oops," thought Henry. "May I have the rings, please?" said the minister. Everyone looked at Henry. "He's got them," said Henry, desperately, pointing at Peter. "I have not," sobbed Peter. Henry reached into his pocket. He found 2 pieces of old chewing gum, some gravel, and his lucky pirate ring. "Here, use these," he said. At last, Pimply Paul and Prissy Polly were married. Cross Colin handed Henry and Peter a basket of pink and yellow rose petals each. "Throw the petals in front of the bride and groom as they walk back down the aisle," whispered Colin. "I will," said Peter. He scattered the petals before Pimply Paul and Prissy Polly. "So will I," said Henry. He hurled a handful of petals in Pimply Paul's face. "Wash it, you little brat," snarled Paul. "Windy, isn't it?" said Henry. He hurled another handful of petals at Polly. "Eek!" squeaked Prissy Polly. "Everyone outside for the photographs," said the photographer. Horrid Henry loved having his picture taken. He dashed out. "Picture of the bride and groom first," said the photographer. Henry jumped in front. Henry peeked from the side. Horrid Henry stuck out his tongue. Henry made horrible rude faces. "This way to the reception," said Cross Colin. The wedding party was held in a nearby hotel. The adults did nothing but talk and eat, talk and drink, talk and eat. Perfect Peter sat at the table and ate his lunch. Horrid Henry sat under the table and poked people's legs. He crawled around and squashed some toes. Then Henry got bored and drifted into the next room. There was the wedding cake, standing alone on a little table. It was the most beautiful, delicious-looking cake Henry had ever seen. It had 3 layers and was covered in luscious white icing and yummy iced flowers and bells and leaves. Henry's mouth watered. "I'll just taste a teeny-weeny bit of petal," thought Henry. "No harm in that." He broke off a morsel and popped it in his mouth. Boy! That icing tasted great. Perhaps just one more bite, thought Henry. If I take it from the back, no one will notice. Henry carefully selected an icing rose from the bottom tier and stuffed it in his mouth. Wow! Henry stood back from the cake. It looked a little uneven now, with that rose missing from the bottom. "I'll just even it up," thought Henry. It was the work of a moment to break off a rose from the middle tier and another from the top. Then a strange thing happened. Whispered the cake. "Go on." Who was Henry to ignore such a request? He picked out a few crumbs from the back. Delicious, thought Henry. Then he took a few more, and a few more. Then he dug out a nice big chunk. "What do you think you're doing?" shouted Pimply Paul. Henry ran round the cake table. Paul ran after him. Round and round the cake they ran. "Just wait till I get my hands on you," snarled Pimply Paul. Henry dashed under the table. Pimply Paul lunged for him and missed. Splat! Pimply Paul fell head first onto the cake. Henry slipped away. Prissy Polly ran into the room. She shrieked. "Wasn't that a lovely wedding?" sighed Mum on the way home. "Funny they didn't have a cake, though." "Oh, yes," said Dad. "Oh, yes," said Peter. "Oh, yes," said Henry. "I'll be glad to be a page for any time."